Mass protests are a common feature of democracies and have been a common feature of Eurasian politics since 1989. Despite the large number of protests, only a small fraction succeed in achieving their goals. This video describes some of the factors behind their success and failure. To summarize, successful protests reach and represent a large and diverse section of the country and have clear goals. They are more likely to succeed when they have unified leaderships and face a government that is divided. While we tend to focus on protests that succeed, the vast majority of them do fail. For example, in Russia in 2011-2012, opposition parties and civil society activists organized protests against electoral fraud in the 2011 parliamentary elections. Between 25,000 and 150,000 people, depending on who you ask, participated in these protests. The protests were significant because they were the biggest to take place in Russia since the 1990s, but they were still relatively small. They were shut down fairly quickly by the government, which arrested around 1,000 protesters and passed legislation further restricting the right to protest. Similarly, in 2020, around 500,000 Belarusians turned out to protest President Lukashenko's re-election. Examples of recent successful protests include the Euromaidan protests in Ukraine in 2012-2014 and Armenia's Velvet Revolution in 2018. While neither of these were election-related protests, both led to the resignation of the country's leader and new elections. Ukraine's protests began as a student movement objecting to Ukrainian President Yanukovych's abandonment of a treaty with the European Union. They then rapidly expanded into a broader movement after the government used force in an attempt to disperse the protesters. As with the single-issue movements that are more common in the region, these protests actually had no political or organizational backing, but were self-sustaining in organizing. In Armenia, protests began after the country's leader reneged on a promise not to run for re-election after a constitutional change. These protests did have a political leader, who organized a series of marches from Armenia's regions to its capital, gradually building support until mass rallies of around 250,000 people took place at the end of April. So what made these protests successful when others failed? In class thus far, we've talked about structural issues. The idea that a country might be more ready for democracy or change when it's more economically developed, for example. In addition, this week we read Valerie Bunce and Susan Wolchik's argument that protester tactics also play a big role in their success. Here I'm going to expand on those ideas, noting the conditions when protesters are more likely to be able to succeed and what the latest successful tactics are. Bunce and Wolchik note one precondition, a necessary but not sufficient condition for protester success, and that's opposition unity. Unity alone does not guarantee success, but it was present in all cases of successful election protests. But when are oppositions more likely to unify? Oftentimes, opposition parties are able to unify around a single political figure, such as a candidate for president. For example, in Belarus, protesters have focused on civil society activist Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, who became the main opposition leader and presidential candidate after the arrest of her husband, a party leader. Political leadership is not a necessary condition for toppling governments, as Euromaidan or even the Arab Spring show, but it's often a necessary condition for the later consolidation of protesters' political gains. Leaderless protests' victories tend to be short-lived. Key tactical elements for these protesters included effective communication strategies and credibility. Bunce and Wolchik focused on the get-out-the-vote campaigns and modern PR tactics that were common in the 2000s. Today, often the most important element is simply spreading information about protests. In the United States, we focus on social media as the way to do that. In Eurasia, tactics vary country by country based on the media environment. In Ukraine, television and conventional media are relatively free and were key to spreading information about the protests. In Armenia, conventional media are controlled either by the state or affiliated business leaders, but Facebook is both uncensored and popular, and it was the main tool used by protest organizers to share information. In Belarus, where all media face strong state restrictions, secure messaging apps and activists based in neighboring countries have been vital to information sharing. Media are not simply needed to share information about protest goals and meeting times, but also to establish the opposition as a credible alternative. Their effective use of these tools shows that they can, in fact, accomplish their goals and potentially lead the country. Opposition unity then contributes to a large and broad base of support for protests. It is axiomatic that protests tend to start small among relatively powerless groups, like students. Successful protests move beyond that base, drawing membership from the middle class and a variety of other sectors. In Armenia, for example, the largest protests drew almost 10% of the country's total population. In addition to opposition unity and effective tactics, I would add two additional necessary conditions for protester success: divisions in elite support for the leader, and divisions within the security services. Even unified and large protest movements can fail in the face of sustained and coordinated government repression. To succeed, effective protests need to be met by an ineffective government. One common result of protests is a split in the political support for a leader. For example, in Ukraine, a large group of parliamentarians declared their opposition to Yanukovych the day before he left the country. These defections can make a significant difference in the protests, particularly when wealthy business leaders decide to put their support behind the opposition. But honestly, they're not usually the decisive factor in protester success. More often, they are a strong signal that a leader is losing a wider range of support. A more decisive factor is divisions within the security services. This can either be seen in the actual refusal of certain elements of the military or police to participate in repression, or it could be in simply the inconsistent government use of force. Protests gain the most support when government repression is either weak or inconsistent. Protests die when force is used on a wide scale over a long duration. An example of weak repression is the case of Armenia. Protesters did not face significant arrests or other police action until weeks after they began. This weak government response allowed the protests to grow larger and larger until they reached a critical mass. Research also shows that inconsistent use of force also generates larger protests. When repression is followed by conciliation, then repression again, governments can also appear weak, as in the case of Euromaidan. This can also lead to splits within the security services between hardliners and more conciliatory elements. On the other hand, Russia and Belarus represent cases of consistent and unified repression. Both governments have prioritized unified security approaches and rewarded loyal security officers with key government positions. They also demonstrate the effectiveness of mass arrests rather than the direct use of force in the streets. So to sum up, protests are often most successful when they have unified goals and leaderships, expand their base of support to a broad cross-section of society, and faced a divided government, particularly among the security services.